This conference will now be recorded.
All right, well, again, welcome to VSD. I'll be your host, Shane Proctor, your course director for the month. So the class structure for this, here, actually, you know what? I didn't even think about this. We do have a slide I can kind of show you. It's a very short presentation, I promise. Intro to VSD. Yes, exploring the digital art medium through light, color, and material properties. So either way, so a lot of what we do in this class is going to be inspired based off reference and photography. So everything is structured in such a way that we provide you with the assets. We give you reference. So these are actually objects that you see in the scene. You'll see it here in a little bit that kind of existed. They are in my possession, so I do have them. I took hundreds of shots, and I've given them to you. So your goal at the end of this class is you're going to basically light, texture, UV, create materials, the whole project, right? The whole setup from start to finish. So you're going to have an asset that you've started with nothing, and you're going to end up with something. So I think that's one of the coolest things about this class. It's not like your previous classes where you might have just kind of, done your thing, and then the next week it's something entirely new. The way everything works here is it kind of builds upon the previous week. So that's also important, is if just make sure you don't fall behind, because it'll tend to snowball relatively quickly if you're not careful. So for instance, if you're working on the UV portion, you'll just want to make sure that's done before the following week. So when you texture those assets, you have proper UVs, right? Seems simple enough, but it tends to happen sometimes. Some changes will be necessary based off feedback that we give you. So what you'll do is you'll revisit those assets if necessary, and you'll make those modifications, and then you'll push forward. So just because you've submitted a project at that point doesn't mean you won't be revisiting it. And this goes for everything else throughout the entire class. So you'll get some feedback. Thankfully, now the class size has kind of gone down a little bit, so we're not going to be completely overwhelmed, so we should be able to get that back to you in a reasonable time. Last month, we were sitting at like 40 students total, which was just insane. Very difficult to keep up with, especially with the just short turnaround time. But that being said, that doesn't mean we can't still, if you need additional attention one-on-one time, we're definitely here to help. So again, my name is Shane Proctor. This will be my contact information right here if you need to get a hold of me. Looking fabulous. So that's what we're going to actually teach you in this class, is some fantastic keynote transitions. This is Ryan Nash. He's going to be your studio artist for the month as well. You might see him grading your work or critiquing it, but he's also available if you'd like to email him. This is our Discord server. So this is one thing I highly recommend you guys check out. It's not required, it's not mandatory, but it's a great way to connect to our fellow artists. So here, let me just show you guys this real quick. Let's see if I have it even open. So our Discord server is set up to basically be this community for all students who have come through VSD at some point. So we have everyone from myself to industry professionals. So Aaron Blankenship was a Fordham grad. He's currently over at, let's see where he's at right now. I think he was trying to get the DNEG. Going to tell me I can't even expand this out. Either way, we have MPC, DNEG, we had Frame Store in here, so we have all kinds of industry professionals. We have graduates, the people who have been through the class. We also have students who have also been through the class, or students who are just like you are now going through it. So if you guys have any questions, you can just post images. We post memes in here too. It's a pretty laid back environment, so it's not super strict. But people will have questions, and whether it's myself or others, we can give you feedback relatively quickly. So the great thing is I'm pretty available pretty much all the time, and I think Mary can attest to that. I think she was messaging me at like 1 in the morning one night, and I'm pretty sure I responded.
Yes, you did.
So we're here to help. I can't guarantee you all the time I'll be available, but even on the weekends we'll be here to help you out. Yes, the new kid. So we also have a links channel, and within the links channel, this will be just useful content that we post. So it could be anything and everything from UVs to just kind of cool tips and tricks, hair breakdown. You know, it doesn't even have to be relevant to like look dev, but mostly look dev in this channel. We have a video link, so if we have any cool animations or just stuff that we think was kind of neat to share. So if you want to see how maybe Ragnarok was kind of created behind the scenes, it's kind of a nice thing to see, right? But again, entirely optional. I do highly recommend. It's a great way to communicate, especially if you need to get a hold of me for whatever reason. Here's the actual project you'll be working on. So this will be your week 1 project. So in week 1, you'll be responsible for 2 things: lighting the scene based off reference. So this will be the image you'll be basing it off of. So we're looking for everything from light direction, shadow softness, light temperature, and so on and so forth. And we're actually going to discuss that today. So we'll go on. We'll go over all of the techniques you'll need to get that completed, but it still comes down to your ability to kind of produce a nice clean render. The second thing you'll be responsible for would be UVs. So you'll have to UV both the pulley and the scraper. So that one can be a little bit of a challenge depending on your comfort level when it comes to UVing. So some people, they're proficient, they'll get it done relatively quickly. Some not so much, it'll take them a bit longer. So, you know, gauge based off your comfort level whether or not you need to spend a couple hours. But honestly, I feel most of you will be able to get it done at least within half an hour per asset, right? If not faster. This will be the kind of the UVs you'll be doing. The other assets are already provided in UV, so you don't have to worry about those. When we start week 2, we'll dive into Substance Painter. So bulk of this class will be dealing with Substance Painter. So we understand that you may or may not have used this program at all, but I guarantee by the end of this class, you'll be quite comfortable and more than capable of producing some high quality textures and taking it back into Maya. So Painter's pretty amazing. I'll tell you that right now. And once you get into it, you're going to be, this is a game changer. So lesson 2 also consists of taking that back out of Painter and applying it back to your assets and rendering it out based off the existing file you've already created. Week 3 will be the pulley and scraper, which will also cover more advanced techniques using Painter. So now the training wheels are coming off, if you will, at this point. You know, we're still guiding you. We're still giving you some good tips and tricks. We're not going to completely leave you in the deep end. But by week 4, we're going to have you kind of dive into Designer. So Designer is kind of another program. So we're not going to spend too much time in here. But you will create a pattern that you will use. So you can see here is that black and white image at the bottom. You'll be able to export like a material from Designer and take that into Painter and leverage that to create your final wall texture. So, and then the model will also be your responsibility. So the setup for the bottle will be a little bit different than what you're used to, but the end result is still pretty amazing. So again, you'll be creating something from nothing.
What we're doing with the model and the wallpaper, isn't that similar to what we can do with RenderMan? We're just learning it with a different program?
Yes, so here's the deal. You'll still be creating the textures, the roughness, and the height variation within Painter, and you'll still be taking it to RenderMan. So yes, good question. Yeah, we need to set the glass. So Painter doesn't actually support proper refraction and transparency, so we actually use RenderMan to do that. Here's the project breakdown. So each week is about 20% of your overall grade, with GPS and discussions being the last 20%. So be very careful about those discussions. Those are some easy points. You know, they're really just pretty straightforward. I'm not really kind of worried about the accuracy of your answer. I'm really more interested in the discussion itself, you know. So just chime in. Yep, software downloads. Okay, so we'll talk about that as well. So your homework will be a little bit more involved. So the big thing with our class is you'll need to make sure your software is up to date. So if you go to FSO and you go to, well, we have a couple of things here. The welcome letter will be your introduction to myself as well as additional contact information. So if you want to call me directly, here's my extension. We also, Jared Edwards was a former instructor in this class. So what you can do is all the videos are also kind of listed within the activities themselves. So we have direct links to those videos, but if you want to subscribe to that as well, you can. Here's that Discord link again. All I ask is you guys kind of set your first and last name on our Discord server so we can identify you. But if you go to course overview, we'll check the software and updates and downloads first. This will be all the software you'll need for this class. Currently, we are in 2018.5, not 2019, but 2018.5. RenderMan does not support 2019 yet, as far as I'm aware. So make sure you grab that. Here's how you can check to see which version you're on. This is an older screenshot, so don't panic. But if you need that, make sure you get that. Some of the UV tools have changed from like even 2018.3 to 0.5, so having that will be very useful. RenderMan is currently up to 22.4. Now, most of you probably haven't touched RenderMan since shading and lighting, which was probably at least over a year, maybe? I'm assuming everyone here has used RenderMan. So if you're on an older version, it is vital that you update. I have an installation guide here. Pretty much all you really need to do is go to the RenderMan site, kind of set that up. So they've changed the way it kind of works, that every 3 months you'll have to renew your license, and then you'll have to just redo that. And it's super easy to reactivate that. You just have to go through their little process to do it. We're also using Substance Painter and Designer 2018. So you'll basically go to Algorithmic's website. We've got a link right here. You'll create an account, you'll log in, and then you go to your little download page. Just make sure you don't do the download, try 30 days for free. It'll work, and it might get you through the class, but if you want to use it for at least a year, make sure you grab the educational license. So when you log in, you'll see a little form you fill out. You'll upload like a picture of some way to recognize that you're a student. I've heard of people uploading pictures of their cat and it still works. So I don't really know if they're monitoring that. Just make sure you get the educational license and you'll be good for a year. And then finally, here is your lab project download, and we'll discuss that here in a little bit. Live lecture and open lab. This is basically one of those live lectures. So basically every Tuesday, I'll do a GoToMeeting. I'll archive the playlist. I'll go ahead and update as well. So we have a complete set of those playlists already available, but I'm always recording new ones. So Discord, as always, 24/7, just leave a message in chat and I'll probably get back to you relatively quickly. So syllabus and rubric, professionalism, and academic policy should be pretty straightforward, but if you need them, they are located there. So moving on. We're going to start with the lighting and UVing, or I'm sorry, the lighting with RenderMan technique. So here's the current assignment. Now, if you scroll down, we do provide you with some additional documentation, so definitely check that out. The video resources are embedded here as well. So some of these are outsourced. So we have like a quick introduction to RenderMan 22. So if we take a look at that, this is not actually by us, but this is by Small Robot Studios, and they've done a great series to introduce you to a lot of the features with RenderMan. Now, the content that is ours has this little VSD flag right in front of it so you don't get lost. So this will be pretty much the same lecture we kind of go over today, slightly with a different voice, but that is Jared. And then, of course, the documentation, we take a quick look at this. We'll kind of go into a little bit more detail what you might be required to do. For instance, kind of like the light setup, what you'll be using as far as the IS light profiles, what you'll plug into it, and so on and so forth, right? And also how to save out the image properly to make sure that there is no issues with that. So this is your reference image. So what you can do is right-click, save image as. Also, I do believe I added it here if you want to just download it through there. So this is still the actual image if you need it. Everything we render out will be at 1080p. But either way, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to be lighting a different scene. It's not going to be a replica of this one, but it is using the same assets which have been rearranged slightly. But that should be okay. So this is my little lecture scene. So the goal with this is to kind of walk you through the process and the techniques you'll be using for this. So quick little breakdown of what's kind of new with RenderMan 22 in case some of you guys have not used it. The biggest and coolest feature, in my opinion, let me just go ahead and create a light real quick. I'll just throw this over here. We can now render in the viewport. So if we click on this little icon, it will render in real time everything I do. And I can still move the camera, or I can break the renderer. Let's try that again. Oh, good. Oh, you know what I did? Whoops. I was like, I just installed 22.4. I was like, oh no, I hope it didn't break. Nope, we're good. We're good. So I can still move the camera, move that around. I can even select the bottle and even move it, and it will update in real time. So this is a huge, huge benefit, right? Because in the past, you had to open up the render view. You had to mess with that. IPR was kind of finicky, especially in 21.7. It wasn't the best. It did the job, but it really wasn't that great. So that's really nice. And we can still do crop regions, so we can do resolution adjustments. So if you want to do like a smaller resolution, vice versa, we can crop a window and render just that area. So this will be a little bit faster. I think somebody typed in chat. Let me check.
I ended up using RenderMan for a previous class. And even with all of this, it still had the same problems of rendering different in the IPR than the actual render.
So you should be getting identical results outside of quality. So we haven't talked about that yet, but when we look at, say, sampling,
right,
we go look at our samples up here. So we have a min and max samples. But you notice how we have IPR samples down here?
correct.
So when we just render the frame, we're getting a higher quality, and then when we IPR, we're getting a much lower quality. So that's pretty typical. But your overall end result should be the same. I'm sorry?
If it would match, then it would look the same. Say I put 128 on the bottom.
Yes, it should look the same. There's no real difference other than IPRs constantly trying to update. So if you make any significant change, it's going to re-render, as opposed to render frame, which will just ignore any changes you make and just keep rendering what the last thing it was.
All right.
So let's go ahead and turn that off for now. Now, again, you will load your shot. There's going to be a camera set up, and it's going to be locked. Don't move the camera, and don't move any of the objects already within the scene. So everything stays where it's at. All right. And that's typically how it's going to work when you're dealing with a shot anyway. As a look dev artist, you're going to get it. The shot's locked down. Nobody's going to want you to change that. Your job is to either light it, texture it, and send it back, right? You're not the art director. Leave that to the art director. Anyways, carrying on. So we have a couple new icons. So if you're in 21, these two are new. They kind of do the same thing. So this will render the current frame. So if I click on this, it's going to open up RenderMan's image tool, also known as it. Let me reset a couple tools here. So I'm going to turn off my pixel readout, monitor controls. This is probably what you're going to see when you first use it. Let me zoom out. There we go. So this is it. The cool thing about it is if this were to crash, Maya stays open. If Maya was to crash, it stays open. If you're doing the IPR in the render view and it crashes, well, you're done. It was a good run. We have the IPR, just like how it works in here. It now works in this view. So this is probably what you're used to as far as functionality is concerned. Let me just make that a little bit bigger. There we go. So we can stop that by clicking on that again. Actually, that's going to re-render it, but if we right-click and stop IPR, we can do that. Speaking of right-clicking, any icon with these little notches on them, right, that means we can right-click. So if you right-click on any of these, you'll get additional options. The ones without the notch, no such feature. These two icons, this one in particular, is just going to simply open it. So if I were to have this closed, and I click on this, it's going to launch it, but not do anything. So that could be handy if you just want to open it and probably load an image in or try to do something slightly different for whatever reason. You know, you're not wasting any resources doing that. Finally, we have the local queue. So the local queue is used for kind of batch rendering. So if you're able to do a RenderMan batch render here, is going to set off the local queue, and you'll be able to see the status of that render and all that good jazz. So you'll see like a percentage, how many jobs are left, and what it's kind of doing behind the scenes. Let me go ahead and close out of Discord just in case. Cool. Finally, we have our lights. So not all of these are lights. This one at the end is slightly different. So first one here is going to give us our typical lights. So your rectangular disc lights are pretty much what you would expect them to be. They are lights with mass. The disk light's just in a circular shape. Your distance light's going to treat more like a sun. We have a sphere light, which will be just a light that's in a sphere, not to be confused with a point light, which is infinitely small. This sphere light actually has mass. So we've kind of pushed away from like the spotlight setup or the point light setup that you might have been used to, like these old lights in here. Down here at the bottom, like these ambient light, the point light, the spotlight, these guys are kind of legacy way of lighting. So everything we light now typically has mass, right? Has a size associated with it. The cylindrical light is like the sphere light, but a cylinder. We're not going to worry about the AOVs. The Pixar dome light, the portal light, the environment daylight, these are great tools. So the dome light is what we can use to light entire environments with one image. We'll discuss this here a little bit further soon. The portal light is excellent for lighting interiors. While this would be considered an interior, we're not actually going to use the portal lights, but if you're trying to get light to push through like a window light source, this is an excellent way to do it. So for instance, if you're trying to push skylight through a window, portal light's the way to do it. Environmental daylight, this one's kind of neat. So the way this one works is I can set a day, a year, an hour, a time zone, a latitude and a longitude, as well as a month, and I can get that time of day's lighting. So where the position of the moon or the sun was in relation to that day, you can light your scene, right? So if you need something that granular, you got it. We won't be using that, don't worry. This is the mesh light. So basically, if you select a mesh, click that guy, this now has become a light source. And if I were to render this, you'll see it will emit light. Wait for it. Wait for it. Okay, maybe not. There it is. So it's pretty subtle right now, but you can kind of see that gradient, that little spill onto the book. And I could kind of bump that up too if I wanted to. So if I go back to this shape here, I can bump up the exposure and kick up that intensity or change the color, do whatever I need to do to kind of get that to work. So, but we won't be using that. But if you were to say, for instance, if you're doing, let's say a light bulb and you needed the filament to glow, this is how you would do that, right? The filament's actually lighting the scene, not so much the bulb. So most students, what they would do is they would create a mesh light or put a spherical light within the bulb, but in reality, it's the filament that's getting really hot and illuminating the surrounding area. So let me go ahead and disconnect that.
Sorry, if you were to put like ambient occlusion onto the material, the polygon, whatever it is, and then still have it emit light, would you be able to like maybe change like a gradient of color to make it look like a glow, or how would that end up?
You could absolutely do that. So if you're comfortable, and you noticed when I had it assigned, it has a color here. So you could technically, or even a texture color, if you had this UV'd, you could just assign your ambient occlusion and it will darken the corners, just like you would anticipate. So it's just looking at value. So the only problem with that is if you want something really, really bright, well, you do have it kind of separated by exposure and intensity. So yeah, you could do that. I think I know what you're trying to do is you want to like create like that lampshade effect. Am I correct?
Yeah, something similar.
Okay.
Like a lava effect.
Ah, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that would absolutely work. So
okay.
Yeah, you could do that.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in creating those kinds of textures because I'd like to get into gaming more. So
if you're going to do it in games, it's different. You would use something called emissive. Okay. So you wouldn't, yeah, it would be a little bit different in games. So if you're going Unreal or something like that, you wouldn't do it this way. Okay.
And this kind of stuff wouldn't even work for a cutscene of a game?
Well, that depends what the cutscene is rendered in. So if some cutscenes are still done in engine, some are not. So if you're doing a pre-rendered, then yes, you could do a mesh light. I think there might be better ways to do lava and then a mesh light. So I might fake it through texture because you probably want to animate that too. I'd have to experiment with that. That's a good question.
Okay, yeah, I'll look into it too.
All right. So, and then light filters are going to allow us to kind of create special effects for those previous lights. So we can attach these just about any of those lights. So for instance, barn doors. So if you're familiar with the barn doors on an actual spotlight on film, we can close those shutters and kind of shape the light. We have a light blocker. So if we need to occlude certain areas, this is not to be confused with the light blocker we're using for our scene. I'll talk about that here in a little bit. We have a cookie filter and Gobo, which are basically identical. They do the same thing, but the cookie has just more controls. So what the cookie does, here, I'll show it. So if you search for like light gobo, you've seen this before. So it's essentially a little disc that you put on top of a spotlight, and it creates like an interesting shadow cast. So it can be anything from, I don't know, something like this where you get interesting light casts on a ground. Now, we used to do this for this particular project where we had people lining up a tree branch. It drove them nuts because it was kind of difficult to line up. So, but yeah, again, we're not using it, but just know it exists. It's a thing. We also have kind of these other filters. So we have like a ramp light filter or a multi-light intensity filter. So what we can do is actually have we can break the physicality of the light. We can actually have the light get brighter, darker over distance. And, if it's a really art-driven thing, right? So if you need it, you have it. These are going to be your materials right here. We'll talk about that later. Volumetrics, so if you're dealing with any atmosphere, clouds, God rays, or anything like that. Holdouts for compositing. Some diagnostic tools, right? We're not going to worry too much about those. Those get a little bit advanced. This one's really useful though. The little shader ball, it actually brings up a preset browser. So you should have a bunch of presets. So what's cool about that, so I'll delete this light. So if I ever need a quick light setup, for instance, I'm an animator, I don't know much about lighting, but I do know RenderMan has some presets. Import and assign, give it a quick render, and there you go. You've got a fully lit scene ready to go. No fuss. If you wanted to change the time of day, maybe use this one here and import and assign this one. Now I have a different color scheme, more sunset. Again, that's the real power of that dome light, right? I can kind of control that. And if I wanted to change the shadow direction, all I need to do is rotate this. So now I'm getting more of that kind of blue sky behind us, and that warm tone is coming from another direction. I can still tweak the intensity if I want to make it brighter. I can up the exposure, and you know what? If I liked it, go with it. Just know it's there. We can turn off the visibility so it doesn't render in the background, but this won't change in the IPR, unfortunately. So, yeah. So that's nice. We also have some material presets. So if you ever needed just some quick and dirty material presets, for instance, let's do maybe some type of gold. We'll assign gold to this, and maybe, what else do we have? Wood. Let's do wood on the table. Let's try this grits oak. See what that looks like. All right. Collapse that preset browser so we can see this a little bit better. Actually, we need to bring that back. We have no lighting right now, so we'll just bring something else here. Import. Should I bring it? Nope. There we go. I love the watermark down there. All right, so we'll render this. And there we go. We have some gold. And again, this is not how we're going to create the gold for like the book or anything. It's just if you need like a quick and dirty preset, it can work in a pinch. And you can see the wood grain here is totally not going the direction we need it to. And we could change that, but we're not going to worry about that. I just want you guys to know there are some presets. So if you need something to just show off and you don't have time, this is always an option. Okay, so let's get rid of that. We'll go ahead and put the material back on. Speaking of material, make sure we don't change the materials. We should be doing this neutral gray. You'll see it in your scene. You shouldn't need to make any changes. So if you make the material brighter or darker, that will affect your final result. All right, so let's start lighting. So we've kind of talked about a lot of this stuff up here. Oh, before I move on, this is amazing. This is the Make Knowledge button. It takes you to the RenderMan 22 documentation. This is actually really well done. So if you have any questions whatsoever, look at this. It's got pictures. This thing was like set up for artists. So if you want to know what the diffuse amount and what that's doing, it'll tell you in a pretty reasonable description, right? They don't get too technical, but they still, you know, they, depending on what you're looking at, they tend to get a little mad sometimes. But for the most part, a lot of this is pretty legible and understandable and digestible. So definitely check it out if you're interested in learning a bit more about specific things. Like, for instance, here's color temperature. We're going to be talking about that, and it tells you everything you need to know about color temperature. All right, so let's take a look at the documentation and see what you are responsible for in this particular assignment. So this is going to be the first portion of the assignment. We'll take a look at the documentation. We'll scroll down. Well, basically, I'll tell you right now, you're going to be responsible for creating this image that you see here. So everything from light direction, shadow softness, shadow fall off, temperature of that light, everything you see here. These are the lights we're using. We're using one Pixar rectangular light for a key light. We're using a piece of geometry as a light blocker to create a little bit of a gradient and shadow. We have another Pixar rectangular light that we're using for the IS light profile. So this is what's going to give us this interesting light cast on the right side of the frame. And then finally, a dome light to create some fill light. That's pretty much it, right? 3 whole light sources. So let's kind of talk about that. So the rectangular light is pretty straightforward. So I'll drop this in the scene, and I'm just going to scale it up a little bit and just rotate it in. We'll render this in frames so we can kind of see this, and let's just kind of play with it. Now, the first thing to note is if I scale this light up, it does get brighter, right? And if I scale it down, it does get darker. For me, this is not a preferred method of working. I prefer to kind of keep that separate. So the scale has a direct impact on the shadow softness. So let me just go ahead and make this a little bit brighter. And then if I scale this down, note the shadow, like it starts to get really, really sharp. And if I keep scaling it down, it will get darker, but you can see that it's kind of like a razor sharp line. Now, if I make it larger and drop that intensity, you can see that shadow is becoming extremely diffused, right? Same back here. Now, I'd rather just kind of control that light intensity and my shadows fall off completely separate. So if I go to my advanced rollout, one of the first things I usually check is this normalize button. That's going to get really dark. That's normal. We just need to up the intensity. So I'm upping the exposure. You can up intensity or exposure. It's up to you. So the difference between intensity and exposure, intensity is more of a linear curve. So think of it as like every 1 grid space. If I go up a value, it goes up in intensity, right? And then it falls off from there. Exposure is more of a exponential. It's a doubling of the brightness. So if any of you guys are familiar with digital photography, if you adjust the f-stop, let's say you go 1 stop down, you've now essentially lowered the brightness by half. Or if you increase the f-stop, oh, nope, I got that backwards. 1 f-stop down, wider aperture, double the brightness, right? So every f-stop you go down, it gets brighter. So exposure works basically every time I increase by a whole integer, I've doubled the brightness of my image. So if I go to 15, it's just going to continuously get brighter and brighter and brighter. And it doesn't take much. So if I go like to 20, it's going to go pretty much completely nuclear. So if you wanted to create fallout, there you go. But we're not going to do that. So we'll do something like 16, right? And so now it comes to kind of figuring out like the shadow fall off here. So again, if I scale this down, you'll notice the light intensity isn't adjusting. It kind of tweaks it a little bit, but it's definitely a lot better. So now I can kind of figure out where this needs to be. So looking at my reference, that's the key, right? So if I look at this, I can see, okay, this bottle is casting a shadow in this general direction. This scraper's got a shadow here. These shadows are coming from another light source, probably this one over here, but hopefully you can kind of understand with that. Now, if I kind of translate this light up, I want you to kind of pay attention to this. So if I need my shadows shorter, I can lift up the light. So essentially like a high noon light. So if I want a shorter shadow, bring the light up. If I want a longer shadow, lower it. like a sunset, right? So the lower that is, the longer the shadow. Well, until you go underneath it, and then you're kind of replicating a high noon, except you're casting shadow from underneath the table. So hopefully you understand that. Similar, if I translate this left and right, I can start to rotate that shadow, right? Obviously, I hope that makes sense, but sometimes it just helps to kind of visualize that. And again, if I wanted that shadow to kind of push more that way, I could still rotate the light and kind of do something like that. So our light isn't perpendicular with the scene, just throwing that out there. So play with it a little bit. And again, shadow softness is directly related to the scale of that light. So if I needed a sharper shadow, scale it down. If I wanted those shadows to kind of converge to a point, right, kind of like it does in the reference, what we can do is break this square look. So right now everything's very uniform, but what if we did this? Notice what the shadow did? It's still pretty soft, but now it's kind of tapering into like a triangle, as opposed to something like this where it doesn't. Right, so keep that in mind when you're lighting. It's going to take some time and adjustment to get that. As far as the other controls here, we do have color. We have color maps. So the cool thing about the color map is we can actually plug in high dynamic range images. I wonder if I have one on hand. Let me check. I might not. Yeah, I'll show you that later. I don't know where that would be, but it's kind of nice because what we can do is when we plug in that texture, we can actually enable the visibility. And so we can create some really interesting reflections based off this. It'll still reflect even if it's not visible, but if we turn on visibility, we can actually see it in the shot, which is kind of nice. We won't see it from behind. I think they just did that so you can see through it, but it is there. Color, obviously, it's going to work just like you would anticipate it. But in this case, we're not going to use color. We're actually going to use temperature, right? So if I enable temperature, we can start to color the light based off Kelvin temperature scale. You've seen this in your old science class. Now, it helps if I could spell Kelvin. So basically, the lower the temperature, the more warm the tone will be, and the higher the temperature, the brighter or hotter the light source. This is kind of, think of it like a sun. So the cooler the star, the more warm or red it's going to be. The brighter or hotter the sun, the more blue it's going to be. So we're simulating extreme temperatures, and we can do that. So if I wanted a warmer tone, I can use like a value of 2000, and we can push this really orange, almost candle-like orange across the entire scene. If we go around 4500, it's a bit more manageable, not as saturated, and looks quite nice. Vice versa, if we go up to like 8000, we can start pushing cooler, bluer tones. So again, we're not throwing any curveballs on you. We are using temperature. We're not using some abstract like 8.623, you know, right? We're not, these are whole numbers. So it's similar with our intensities and our positioning. We're not trying to do some really abstract value. We're not looking for pixel perfect at any point. We're just looking that you kind of match it relatively close. So in this case, if we look at this, let's go back to our thing here. So I'm going to say that's a bit of a cooler tone and then a much warmer tone on the right. So let's see about kind of maybe lowering this a little bit, maybe a little bit higher. Yeah, that's feeling pretty good. We have some other controls here. We won't be using these particular controls for this particular asset, but it's good to know. Emission focus is going to kind of focus that light much like a spotlight. So if you wanted to kind of create a spotlight effect, you could do that. The tint will allow us to kind of color the outside of that light source, kind of breaks it a little bit, but what you can do is just kind of lighten it a little bit. Honestly, you typically keep that black. Specular and diffuse amount, we don't have anything that's specular right now, but specular would be like that mirror reflection or highlight. So we can actually turn the specular off on this light. So for instance, if you had a couple light sources that were reflecting in a character's eye, and you didn't want that to happen, we could localize it to, we can say, you know what, how about you don't highlight the eyes with this particular light, but I still want to light the scene, just don't reflect, right? Vice versa, we can also have a light rig that just creates specular in the eyes, but doesn't light the scene by disabling diffuse amount. Now, as far as the intensity near distance, this one's kind of neat too. Let me go ahead and position this light a little bit closer. And so what's going to happen is you're going to see it kind of get really hot on this wall, right? So this is a very common problem where the intensity is just too much by the wall, but it looks really good over here. So first thing you think of is like, okay, I just need to lower this. And oh, now it's too dark back here. I need some intensity, but I don't want to blow out this area. So what you can do is start to increase this value. Now, I believe it's based off the grid, so you might have to go pretty high with this value. So let's try like 100. And you can see that's starting to affect it, right? So now it's no longer blowing out the scene, but I still get kind of that light intensity. Let's try like 50, right? We're still getting it, but no longer as nearly as hot. So if you just take like a snapshot, I'll put this back to 0, you can kind of visualize the difference. So this is kind of a nice way to kind of control that if you're having lights that are really close to a wall for whatever reason. Again, we're not using any of these refined controls. I'm just showing you that they exist. Cone angle. As I lower this cone angle, I can kind of create very similar to barn doors. So if I wanted to focus that light, and of course, cone softness, you can create some really interesting kind of light cast like this, right? Yeah, I like that. That looks nice. Light and shadow is what makes things look interesting. In this case, we'll keep the cone angle and softness at 90 and 0 respectively. Shadows, all you need to know is don't adjust it. Never adjust the shadow color. That's when things start looking weird. All right, just keep that black. If you want to create artistic choices, yeah, go ahead and change it. Typically, you just leave that alone. All of these other settings are pretty much not important right now. Any questions on that? And let me know if I'm going too fast for you guys. I don't mind. We can take a little bit longer if you need it. I'll check chat real quick. No questions. Awesome. Good, good, good. Alrighty. So that is kind of our key light, right? And I'd say good enough for what I'm looking for. Obviously, this doesn't match the reference we're going for, but I just want you to understand that we can kind of change this. And you know, if I wanted the shadows sharper, just scale it down. Vice versa, you can scale it up, and you're good to go. So we do have another light source that kind of creates an interesting light cast, right? I'm going to go ahead and create another Pixar rectangular light. We'll scale this up, bring this up. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and just normalize it right now, and I'm going to aim it straight down. So when I'm working with light profiles, IS light profiles, I like to kind of push them up against the wall. So I'm holding J to actually snap in increments there. And now I'll just translate it to the wall, push it down, pull it out. I don't want to clip the wall. So pushing it up against the wall and aiming it straight down is a great way to visualize this. I'm going to go ahead and turn up the intensity so we can see this. And just for now, just so we can speed up this render, we'll hide the other light. And we'll go ahead and bump this up a little bit more, maybe a little too hot. Cool. Let's enable temperature and maybe make that a little bit warmer. Let's try around 4,500. 5,000. There we go. I'm feeling that. So the cool thing about these light profiles, you can see it does have a very unique light cast, all right? So how do we simulate that? So light profiles are actually kind of neat. So what we can do is actually create light patterns like this. Now these are typically made by the manufacturers of the lights themselves. Now you can find a bunch of kind of pre-made ones. There's some on the Brainer Man's site, you know, but if, let's say you were an architect and you needed to tell the contractor like what bulb to use and what it's going to look like, right? These are very specific design choices that they have made to make sure the client gets the most accurate result, right? So there's no guessing. It's like, okay, this bulb is going to produce this result, right? So light manufacturers have produced what we call IS light profiles, and it's a mathematical function. It looks like a lobe. Let's see if they have a profile of that here. Typically, you'll see it like this, right? This makes the most sense. But you can actually make your own, which is kind of neat. Here it is. So you can actually kind of design your own light profiles. And this is like these will actually split the color channels. So it's kind of interesting. You know, if you're savvy in math and physics, have at it. Not for me. I will just use whatever I'm told to use. But here we go. So light profiles can actually be plugged in to the light profile. Imagine that. So we have IS profile. We'll click open. Now what's important here is that you set your project. So if you don't set your project, if I click on this workspace root, it's actually going to take me to my project set. I've already set it before we started this discussion. So make sure you're setting your project. In fact, the project set for this class is so vital, so important, it is critical you do it, especially when you start rendering. If you can't find your textures, it's not going to render, period. Right? It's just going to be like, nah, couldn't find a texture, I'm done. Good luck. And you'll be forced to, set your project, resource your images if necessary, and so on and so forth. Let's take a quick look at that project set real quick. So the one I've provided you with looks kind of like this. We have a couple extra folders. One, the IS light profiles. So we have a bunch in here for you to play with. We are using the X arrow. So that's where you'll find that. We have our scenes. So that's going to be the scene you're working with. Be sure to save in increments. It's good practice. Within the source images, here's the HDR you'll be working with, and we're about to talk about that, but that's pretty much it. We do have an OBJ folder, so when you come to the UVing, if you want to just work with these objects at world space, at origin, you can do that. Otherwise, you can UV where they stand and be completely fine. So let's go ahead, open up the profiles, load in our X arrow here. And you'll notice that it got really, really, really bright. So these profiles actually have an intensity built in. So again, those manufacturers have designed this to look a certain way. Well, unfortunately for us, we don't want that right now. So what we're going to do is actually normalize the profile. We could do like a negative intensity here and kind of bring that back, or even set this to 0, or even a really low value. And you can see that's working. But I feel it's easier just to kind of normalize this. So not to be confused with the advanced normalization, this is profile normalization. So now if I crank this back up, you'll be using more reasonable values. Now, as far as positioning this, you can move it around. You can pull it away from the wall, and that's going to change the shape dramatically. So as I pull this away, you're going to see the shape gets much, much wider. And if I bring it closer, it gets much sharper. Now, whatever you do, just don't do this. Don't clip the wall with your light. That's typically bad practice anyway. It'll work, but what it's doing is actually lighting the backside. We can't see it because of the way the materials are set up, but if I were to turn on double-sided, it would light both sides, right? At the cost of your render time. So typically a good practice is just don't shove the light into the geometry, any geometry, just kind of leave it there, right? From there, it's just gonna be a matter of kind of positioning this. Again, looking at the shadows of that pulley, I can determine if I want a longer shadow. I can pull that away. I can lift it or lower it. So if I want a longer shadow, right? It's probably somewhere around there. And then I would just kind of line up. This one's gonna be a little bit easier to line up because you can see it in the reference. So there's a little less guesswork involved. Now lighting is additive, so if you get your intensities right, just make sure you kind of turn them on and see what they kind of look like all together, right? And you can see that's kind of working out pretty nice. Now again, I've just been in the perspective, but you'll want to do this from the render cam and just kind of check it out every once in a while. Now you can still move this too while you're in this view. I'm just gonna, let's see if we can do this real quick. Actually, probably the best way to do that is probably do the split panel view. I'm not going to worry about it right now since my real estate's kind of an issue. Oh, good. This light's coming for the ride. Let's bring that back. Right around here. Perfect. Good enough for me. So now we are missing one additional light source, right? You can notice that our shadows are quite harsh, quite dark, right? So what we want to do is kind of fill the entire environment with some additional light. This is where that dome light kind of comes into play. So the second icon here will allow us to create that dome light. And with the dome light, the most important thing here is that we use an image, right? Because by default, we're just going to get this white color, and it's just going to flood the entire scene with white. Now, if we change this color to, say, I don't know, green, it'll do the same thing, right? So we don't want to do that. What we're going to do is just look at our color maps. We go back to our workspace root, go to our source images, and we can load in Bus Garage. So you might see something like this. So notice how these images are grayed out. So you're not going to see these additional images up here, the .tex, or these other ones. Actually, there's my light texture. I might show it to you after all. So this is what's going to happen to you. These are going to be grayed out. You're going to try to click on it. I clicked on the wrong one. You're going to try and click on it. It's not going to work. Just make sure you change the files of type to either images or any. And now you can select whichever one you want. Click open, and you're good to go. So this is going to give you the warm tones and the kind of fill light across the entire scene. Cool. There's no other real refinement necessary for the dome light. Don't go changing the intensity or exposure. If you have to change this, it's probably because your key light or your warm light are not set up correctly. So just make adjustments there. There should be no adjustments to this particular object. From there, you can name your lights, group them, organize it, keep it nice and clean. But maybe we kind of want to actually render this out now so we can save this out and get it ready for submission. So this is where we're kind of done with IPR. Or not. IPR doesn't want to go away. Here we go. So this is when we start going to our actual render frame. So if we render this, it's going to look at it through the current camera, right? So that's not good. So we'll just go ahead and hit escape and cancel that. Now, it would be nice if you could right click here and just choose the camera. Unfortunately, it's not that savvy. So you just go to your render cam and then click render. All right, so by default, your final image is still going to be quite grainy. So we have to kind of adjust the samples to alleviate a lot of that. And we'll kind of talk about that. But first, let's kind of talk about this particular interface. So with it, the controls are pretty straightforward. Your middle mouse will kind of zoom in and out. Hitting 1, 2, and 3 will kind of change between the tools. So 1 is your pan tool. 2 is going to be your zoom tool. So if you want like a smoother zoom as opposed to kind of this clickety zoom, you can do that. 3 is going to be your render region. So if I mark a region, oh, that's off center. So this is kind of a weird bug. If it happens, just reopen the interface and it should fix itself. In fact, I'll just do that right now. I'll hit 3 and it's still doing it. Lovely. All right, that doesn't matter. We don't need it right now. Let's try this. Oh, now it's working. All I did basically is hit 1 to 1, and now I can essentially, let's try this. Let's zoom out now. Will it? Yeah, so it's working. So just hit 1 to 1, reset the view, and you should be okay. And if I want to kind of, I have this extra real estate on the sides. If I zoom into whatever size I want it to, I'll just hit Command F to kind of frame it, and now I'm taking up a little less real estate here. Now, as far as like other functionality here, yeah, we have the render frame. We can scrub through. We have some other features here we're not going to kind of dive into just yet, but I want to kind of introduce you to the catalog. So if I hit C or even go to Window and Catalog, I can open up this panel on the left. So this panel on the left is kind of neat. So let's say I make a change. In this case, we'll go to this guy and maybe change the color to 3000. Pretty significant, right? It's not going to update, but if I just click on this window, make it active and hit R, I'm going to re-render that frame. And now I'm going to see that change. So that key light is extremely warm. But I want to kind of compare this. I want to see what kind of changes I've done. So I can actually go back in that catalog and kind of see it. So I can just keep going back and forth. Note how it's still rendering. So I can look at this one. I can save it out. I can do whatever I want. I can go back to Maya and continue working. The render here is going to keep going, right, until it finishes. Now, you might want to take a closer look and kind of see how long it took. You can kind of expand it and see the process, and you can even see it down here. It's going to take a while, right? As it starts to speed up, you'll notice that these little buckets, we call them, the blue squares are called buckets. Once it reaches its sample level and it says this is good enough, it'll stop sampling that area. But you can see it's still kind of sampling every little spot. So every time a bucket hits an area, that area is receiving one additional sample per pixel, up to 128, at least with the default settings. So what other controls do we have here? The inspector. So the inspector is kind of cool too. If I go back to this original render, I can see how long it took to render this current pass, right? How long it took to achieve this result. Well, this is nice too, because in the inspector, I can add notes. I can say first render with lighter color. And now if I ever go back to this, I kind of have a little note to say, hey, this is what I was doing in this particular shot, right? As opposed to like this one, as soon as I hit escape, it should populate or not, but we can still put notes there. So that's the inspector. Usually the inspector you can kind of keep hidden unless you need it. The catalog is also pretty useful to just keep open in the first place. I'll usually kind of minimize it like that. I don't really worry too much about the render time. I'll usually kind of look at the end result of the render time when it's done. Let's get rid of that. Oh, good, just made it again. So other tools that are extremely useful, the pixel readout, the monitor controls, and if you're an animator, the sequence controls. So if you want to kind of play blast, or not so much play blast, but want to see like a frame range, you can do that as well. Now the monitor controls are going to allow you to kind of gamma slam. Now this is just affecting how we perceive it. This is not actually altering the image, so just be aware of that. And then down here, this is our pixel readout, so you can see what color space we're in, the value of that current pixel. So exactly right here, it's 0.50877, so on and so forth. That's RGB. And then the XY coordinate. And then in the very bottom left are the channels we're currently viewing. So currently they're all illuminated, so we're seeing all channels. If I hit A, that's all channels. If I hit S, which would be red channel, D is green, F is blue, G is alpha, H is going to be luminance. So if you accidentally hit like your S key, this happens, and it goes black and white, just make sure you look down here to see if it's all highlighted. So just hit A to go back to your color view, and that'll solve that problem. Okay, now if I want to do like a swipe comparison between two images, what I can do is set a background image. So clicking on this icon right here will kind of set this as a background. Notice how this icon color has changed. And then I'll click on the one I want to compare with. And with this tool active, the wipe tool, I can now click and drag and kind of compare between the two, right? And I can flip this vertically as well if I want to go up and down. Now this is really nice because what you can do in theory is plug in the reference, right? And kind of do a comparison. Unfortunately, in practice, this doesn't work. The problem is that the image you bring in is in a different color space than the image you're rendering. And so what ends up happening is one image looks wrong, and if you don't realize it, you're trying to match the wrong image, or vice versa, trying to light based off the wrong image. Yeah, I think you understand what I'm saying. So just the best way to do it is don't do the swipe comparison for the comparison. So you can still, like for instance, if we go to File, Open File, you can load in your actual texture. Not your texture, but the, let's see here, I should have it. Project examples, here's our lesson 1, PNG, we'll load that in. So you'll actually see, so this is the render, and this is my result. Obviously, it's not lining up because my scene is a little different, but if I were to set this one to my background image, and I do a swipe on this, look what happened to my reference, or my render, I should say. My reference looks correct, but my render got really dark, right? So this is kind of a problem. Look at the color space. This has changed, right? So it's just, you know what? we might be able to fix that. So this is linear. Let's take automatic off. I'm playing a dangerous game right now. Oh yeah, that's not gonna work. sRGB, yeah, nope, don't like it. Nope, just keep it automatic. Don't mess with it. It's just not gonna work that way we want it to. So the best thing you can do is just kind of go back and forth like this, and it'll maintain the correct color space. All right, so let's save this out. Let's say this is rendered well. We haven't talked about sampling yet, but let's just go ahead and save this out and see what happens. So we'll go to File. We're not going to save session or export catalog. We're actually going to export file. And we'll throw this on the desktop. We'll name it ASTIF. And PNG is a perfectly fine format. Just don't do JPEG as there's image compression. PNG is what we're looking for. So we'll save it to the desktop, and I want you to take a mental snapshot of what we're looking at right now. Let's take a look at this. Oh, perfect. That's exactly what we didn't render, right? So what's happening? So because the color space is a significant consideration, we need to make sure when we're saving this out from the render view that we actually embed that color information. So everything we're doing here is in linear color space. Everything we do in Maya, linear, right? Except we're viewing it in sRGB color space. So if I were to look at this, go to View, go to my display view and turn it off, look what happens. So this is what we're getting. So you can blame the old CRT monitors for all of this, but linear workflow is the thing now. So what's happening is everything coming in, image color space is linear, and we're viewing it in sRGB color space, right? So when we save this out, we want to go to Catalog and do burn-in mapping on save. This is only for taking it straight to web. All right, if we're going to a compositing package like Nuke, Photoshop, After Effects, or anything like that, we'll keep everything linear. In fact, you wouldn't even save out a PNG at that point. You would save an EXR. But if we're going straight to web, like you want to post this on Facebook, enable burn-in mapping, go to File, Export File, ASTIF2. Very technical term. And if we look at this, the render is correct, right? Looking much, much better. All right, so that is super important. So make sure you do that. As far as the sampling is concerned, so let's talk about that real quick. Sampling can be somewhat confusing and a bit overwhelming at times, but I'll give you some techniques to kind of help diagnose that. Now, there is no magic number. You can crank these values up and get a really nice render, but you might be sitting there for a while waiting for this thing to kind of finish. So we have minimum samples, we have max samples, we have pixel variance. All of these are related to when we use the render frame button. We also have dark follow-up, but we're not going to worry about that right now. So when I render this, this is kind of what we get. Now, it didn't finish. We didn't allow it to finish. I think, I wonder if that's no, that's my zoom percentage. I wish I could tell you how far that got along, but here's what we can do. Instead of waiting for this entire frame to render, pick the noisiest part of this image, hit 3, and just like marquee that region. So usually shadows are the culprit, right? And hit R. So now I'm going to just render this area, and it's going to go a lot faster. So now we can actually see if this is making an improvement. So this will actually finish within our lifetime, and now we can make adjustments based off that. So you can see even at 128 samples, it's still kind of grainy. It's kind of wrapping up, but it's overall it's not too bad. Again, I'm zoomed in, right? It finished. If I hit 1:1, if you still see grain, obviously the codec compression of the webinar might blur this a little bit, but there is grain here. I would say this level of grain is still too much. So we have a couple controls for that, but it's kind of hard to figure out how to tweak that, right? We have minimum samples, okay. We have max samples, okay, but how much is it pulling? We don't quite know, right? So there's a way we can kind of diagnose this. This can get a little advanced. We're gonna go to our AOVs, and we're going to click on beauty over here, and we're going to scroll down, and we're going to look for something called diagnostics. So these are called, AOVs are basically arbitrary output variables, frame buffers, you might have heard it called, or render passes. So we're going to look at sample count. I'm going to just basically double click on that, and I've added it to my render. And again, I had beauty selected. If you don't have beauty selected, it's going to give you a prompt to probably create a whole new section here. This is all I want to do. I just want to add this, okay? So check this out. I'm going to hit R again. And notice over here on the far left, we now have a little bitty drop down. If I double click on this, let's expand this out, I can see my sample count. Okay, cool. What's that do? Oh, perfect. It's pure white. So what's happening here? Look down here at my pixel readout. That is the amount of samples those particular pixels are using. So right here, it's using 122. Right here, it's using 81. Because it's beyond 1, it's just pure white. So if we use this exposure control, we can actually see it, right? We can pull that back to the point where it's at least readable for our human eye, if you will. So you can see that these areas that are really bright still are hitting 128 samples. So if I look at my render and click on the reset here, and if I still have noise here, I now know it's hitting 128 samples, but still not resolving. That means I need to go up on my sample count. So let's try 256 and render this. And we wait. Try to keep these in powers of 2. That's going to give you the best result. Any questions so far while this is rendering?
What about the pixel variance and the dark fall off?
Oh, we're getting there. We are getting there. Don't worry. So the pixel variance is actually a very important attribute here. We were actually hitting mostly 128 in those areas. So you can see I'm still getting quite a bit of noise, but we increased the sample. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to look back at this particular area, and I'm going to just undersample this. Let's take a look at this. It's sampling more, but it's not hitting 256. These areas, they're 164, 188, 177, 219, and it's still like 100 in the shadowy areas. So what's happening? It's using this pixel variance as a way to kind of gauge an error threshold. So this value determines, hey, do I need to sample this area more, yes or no? If yes, sample. If no, give up, move on, stop sampling at whatever value you get here. So if we lower this pixel variance to something like 0.01, this is actually going to increase the quality. So let's re-render this. It's going to take longer. Now I'm rendering with my exposure at -7, so this is going to start to like illuminate as it samples more and more and more. But what should happen is we're going to get a lot. We should start clipping our 100 or 256, right? So those areas that were like 177 should now push to 256, and those areas that were 100 should push maybe around the 200s or in the 170s as opposed to 100. Let's reset this. Oh, we got to look at the actual pass here. So you can, I mean, you can eyeball it too. If you're just looking at this, obviously, if it looks good, it looks good, right? But the sample count is kind of a nice way to kind of diagnose this visually. And you can see, even at -8, every sample, every pixel is still going, right? We don't have any, oh, now we're starting to get some value change. Some areas have sampled less. But take a look. We are definitely hitting that threshold. It's hitting 512, 556, everything here is 556, except for this little area that's not even in the shadow. I didn't even know you could do that. So that's M, I guess for marker. Learn something new every day. But look at that. Now, again, I'm zoomed in. Obviously, it's going to look kind of grainy. But if I click 1:1, you can start to argue like, yeah, you know what, that's kind of acceptable. That's looking pretty good, right? But again, that's almost kind of clipping. We're kind of eliminating some of our adaptive sampling techniques here. So maybe what we can do is kind of increase to like 512 and let this pixel variance kind of do some of the work to where certain areas get sampled less, right, as opposed to sampling. So what we kind of created before is something like this, where everything was at minimum 256, right? So we don't necessarily need to sample this pixel up here 256 times. We just need to sample these areas 256 times, right? So this pixel variance is like a hair threshold. So don't go like 0.001 and expect this thing to ever finish, because it's basically going to max out, guaranteed. Keep your minimum. Typically, I'll keep my minimum at like 4, and my max samples will vary. It really, there's no magic number here. It will vary. I've seen students use 512. I've seen higher, for like motion blur or depth of field, right? Up to 1024, you know, very specific shots might need more samples. Some might need less. Really come down to what you need. Now, a little grain's okay, because what's going to happen is we're going to eventually apply texture to this anyway, and that will kind of disappear. So because there's texture, it's going to be like, oh, I need to sample this area more either way. So the dark fall off is just basically if a value goes below a certain threshold to just stop sampling. So if it's like pure black, it'll just deprioritize that area. So usually the default is fine for that. Bonus, if you want to kind of impress your friends and be like, check this out, you can change your bucket order from circle to, I don't know, space fill. Check this out. It's going to sample a bit differently. So remember that radial circle? Now it's like a bunch of squares kind of going in a circle, right? And if you have more memory, you can change your bucket size. But if you're on the laptop, just keep it at default. But if you're on like a workstation with like 32, 64 gigs of memory, you can increase the bucket size and your renders will actually go faster. So that in a nutshell is kind of the sampling. Now there's some other controls here too that we can kind of control the individual samples. So let me show you this as well. So we have this pixel variance here. I'm going to set this back to like 0.02, which is still pretty good quality. 256. So we can actually localize samples to a particular object. So the bottle, for instance, tends to be, when we apply the refraction to it and make it glass, it tends to be a bit noisy. If we go to the RenderMan controls here, what we can do, I wonder if they change it. These are kind of new here. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to worry about that. Never mind. 22.4 has changed the way. Okay, so we do have this pixel. This is what I'm looking for, actually, the relative pixel variance. So what we can do is when it's set to 1, it's pulling from the render settings. If I lower this to, say, 0.00 or like 0.5, or yeah, it's going to do. What's the best way I can explain this? So if this, let's say if my pixel variance for whatever reason was 0.1, the bottle is going to be 0.05. 0.05. That makes sense. It's doing half of this. And if vice versa, if I go up, then essentially the bottle, if my settings were 0.1, it's going to do 0.2, right? So I can super sample the bottle. So for instance, if I do again 0.1 here, and then I lower this to like 0.1 here, so 1/10 of this. Let's just demonstrate this real quick. There's math involved. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. And let's take a look at this. So eventually what's going to happen is this thing is going to just sample pure white over here, and then as normal everywhere else. You can already see that happening, how it's still sampling on this side where the bottle is. And the bottle is just going to stay white, right? Because we're telling it, sample this object more because I told you so. Okay, but you shouldn't have to worry about that. But if for whatever reason you have a very specific render issue, you could kind of diagnose that with that particular guy. So we also have light samples, BXDF samples, and indirect samples. So if you can isolate where the noise is coming from, you can also increase these values. So light samples will be your direct lighting. Indirect lighting will be like mostly the dome. So you can increase this. Don't go crazy, right? Whole values here, 2, 3, 4 should be more than enough. BXDF are your material samples, okay? Whew, marathon. What else do we have here? Let's take a look at this. Some bonus stuff here. So I've got IPR running. Now, I love that space filter. Look at that. Whee! We have a couple integrators. So by default, we've been using Path Tracer. RenderMan uses, or not RenderMan, Pixar uses Pixar Unify, but this is a beta version. Don't use it right now until it's fully released, but this is what they're using in-house. Pixar occlusion, it's going to do exactly what you think it's going to do. It's going to give us an occlusion pass. So if we save this out, we can use this for our composites or whatever. We have Pixar default, so if you want to diagnose trouble or troubleshoot various issues, we can just get a flat render. VCM is great because it fully supports caustics. So if we look at this, caustics, you've seen this, I promise, caustics pattern, right? So kind of the refraction, reflection caustics, so stuff like that. VCM will give you out of the gate without having to do anything about it. Now, if we are in Path Tracer, we actually have to turn caustics on. So we would have to allow caustics. That really comes down to scene specific. Yes, caustics is a natural phenomenon. Typically, you would want to turn that on, but it is expensive to render. Path Tracer handles larger scenes quite nicely. And if you're doing like indoors or anything with a lot of reflective mirrors or metals, VCM is probably going to be the best way to go. So usually we're either using Path Tracer or VCM. And then finally, the visualizer. You could do a wireframe unshaded. You could do a flat wireframe. You can turn that off if you wanted to. So whatever reason you needed this, there you go. But for all intents and purposes, just stay on Path Tracer. Questions?
None, I'm good.
That shadow is smoother. Yes, it is. Okay. So again, the goal with the lighting is to replicate the reference we provided, right? Oh, the one thing I didn't talk about, the light blocker. Let me show you how easy this thing is. Back to Maya. So the light blocker, render view, go back here. You're gone. So let's render this out. And the light blocker is just simply a polygon cube that we've kind of positioned somewhere around here. And all its purpose is to kind of create a little bit of gradient on that wall, if that makes sense. So if we let that kind of converge a little bit, you'll see we are now getting a little bit of occlusion. Let me just hide this light so it makes a little bit more sense. It'll go a bit faster if I hide the dome. And that super warm color is starting to bother me. All right, so if I kind of position this like closer to the light or closer to the scene, you can see I'm creating kind of a different light cast. Again, I don't want you to like clip the environment. We don't want this really harsh shadow. It's just a nice subtle gradient. You'll have to kind of play with this in relation to the light itself. Since my light is a little bit more forward, if I kind of adjust this, I can even do this, start to kind of pull it in front of the light. Just be careful. You don't want to block all of the light. But now I'm kind of creating that kind of occlusion there. So again, the goal here is just to kind of create that small fall off. So look here, you can see we're still getting a nice intense lights on the left side of the bottle, but everything here on that wall is just got a nice little gradient applied to it, okay? So again, your goal is to match this image to the best of your ability. We're not looking for pixel perfect, but we're looking for pretty close. All right. Finally, UV mapping, everyone's favorite. So I'm just going to kind of discuss the scraper. I think this one kind of makes the most sense, and then I'll just kind of show you some techniques with the pulley. We do have guides. We have some videos that'll kind of walk you through it. Now, the video resources are a bit different than what I'm going to talk about, but they still work. They'll get the job done. These are examples. These are not the law, right? You don't have to match these verbatim, but if you did, you'll be fine. You'll get an A, right? No problem. So let me go ahead and open up the other scene real quick that has the actual, oh, this one's good too. Here, let's talk about ray depths real quick before we go to UVs. So I've got a simple scene here. So let me explain the scene real quick. On this back wall here and then the wall behind the camera, these are mirrors. And then I have one directional light kind of coming in this direction. So obviously, when you look at this, it looks kind of weird, right? The shadows are extremely dark. I've kind of modified the renderer to do this. So if I look at my render settings, I've changed the way my max specular and max diffuse depth are working. So at 0, I get direct light only. No indirect light, no light bounce. So there's no red spilling onto the wall. There's nothing filling in the shadows. But as soon as I take this diffuse depth to say 1, check out what happens. Now the light is so intense, it hits here and bounces back over here. And we're starting to see some of that red spill from these other objects, right? And so if we increase this, we just get more and more bounces. Obviously, the point of diminishing returns is kind of dependent on the scene, but the same could be applied to the specular depth. So specular is, again, reflection. So as I increase that, I now see the mirror of itself. So I'm seeing the reflection, right, of the objects in the environment. But the other side is still black. So this is another mirror, again, behind the camera. So as I increase the specular depth, we can go deeper, right? So this is a special case scenario where we need to go quite high to get this to work. So for instance, if I start to up this to 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 12, right? We can still see that effect things, and we might have to go pretty high, but eventually we're going to start clipping out. Notice how kind of at 8, nothing was changing. Check this out. We have a max depth parameter. So basically these two are added and saying, hey, we've hit the threshold, stop increasing the depth. So no matter what, so whatever it needs first, it kind of does, and then it'll clip. So if we say increase this to 20, we can now push this value well past, and we can push it towards infinity, if you will. That's ray depth in a nutshell. All right, sorry, complete tangent, but I think that's still good relevant content. VSD project. All right. So this is pretty much going to be the scene you guys are going to be working with. No lights in here. But again, I'm giving you guys the option to either UV the assets where they stand. Both will work just fine. Or what you can do is just import the asset from the OBJ folder. So if you go to your workspace root, you'll have an OBJ folder. You won't have these. These are UV. You'll have these though. You're welcome. So in this case, if I bring in the scraper and I move this over, there's our scraper blade. So this is that world space. And it was at origin. This kind of makes projection a little bit easier. The end results can be the same. Again, it really, really doesn't matter. It really just comes down to your personal preference. I will go ahead and UV this one so I can demonstrate how to transfer UVs to an asset that's already UV'd, or not UV'd, I should say. So first things first, let's go ahead and switch over to UV mode. So over here in the workspace dropdown, we have a UV editing mode. This is quite nice because it lays out our tools. So we have our perspective view, our UV editor, and our UV toolkit. So this is very nice. If I select this object, you can say we have some wonderful UVs. That's looking really good. And no UVs on this one whatsoever. So when we're UVing, there's a few rules to keep in mind. Good texel density, maximize the 0 to 1 space, reduce the seam count as much as possible while minimizing stretching. That's pretty much it, right? We're taking a 3-dimensional object and we're just laying it flat so we can paint textures to it. That's the goal, all right? We have a various amount of techniques to help us kind of do that, but hopefully from tonight, what you see is I don't use a whole lot of these tools because they're not really needed. So everything you see over here, a lot of this is just not necessary. They're useful, don't get me wrong. They serve a purpose, and you might use them once or twice here and there, but for the most part, I'm going to rely on a couple of tools: move and sew, cut, unfold, and project UVs. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Before we get started, make sure when you're doing this, go to your plugin manager and look for 3D Unfold. Make sure this is running. This is a game changer. If this is not running, your results are not going to be as good as mine. So just make sure this is loaded and you're good. You'll know if it's not loaded if you go to do an unfold and you don't see these options up here. If you don't see options up here, that means your tool or your plugin is not loaded. So I'm going to go ahead, hit Control-1, isolate select, and just focus on this guy. Now I've turned on the shaded view here. So clicking on these two will kind of switch between them. take a look. Thank you.
Mhm.
Are we not stacking the UV shells in the editor? Stack? No. Wait. What do you mean?
Yeah, so when we lay out the UVs, normally if we do it on like in the world space when we import the OBJ, we've been kind of um, taught to do like you can copy it, I suppose. So you'd have two of the same UVs, like one for the top, one for the bottom, and then you'd have the whole perimeter around it.
I'm not familiar with your technique. If anything,
Okay,
after
well then, are we actually gonna be creating two different substances, like two different texture maps for like the metal part and the wood part? Is that what we're
no,
gonna end up doing?
we're going to do it all with one texture set.
Ah,
Yeah. So all the UVs, we're not going to split this up into multiple UVs. The scraper blade will share one UV space. The pulley will share one UV space. The book as well. The only thing we're going to do multiple texture sets is going to be the table and washers because they're two separate objects. But we'll talk about that when we get there. Good question.
okay, thanks.
All right, so the first thing we need to do to even get started is to create some UVs. We have UVs here, but they're utter garbage, right? So these are useless to us. So there's a couple of ways we can do that. We can do create over here. We can do create UVs over here. We can do UV create over here. It's all the same thing. So I'm just going to have this select in object mode, and I'm just going to click create planar map. I'm going to go to the options real quick. Now, as far as which mapping type I usually use either automatic, camera, or planar. I'm not a fan of cylindrical or spherical, but they do serve their purpose every now and then. Again, the end result will still be the same no matter how you approach this. I could do a spherical map on the scraper blade and still get the same result. It just requires a bit more cleanup. So if I go to planar map options, by default, these are the settings. I'm going to go set it to y-axis because if you think about it, I want to just project straight down, and I'm going to keep aspect image ratio. It's just going to make it a little bit more recognizable over here. So if I click apply, there we go. Kind of looks like the scraper blade, right? Let's go ahead and separate this to make our life a little bit easier. This model is in pieces. So it's modeled in pieces. So if we kind of separate these elements, it might make it a little bit easier for you to work with. Just keep in mind, you don't want to freeze the transforms at this point, because if you want to make sure they snap back together, you want to just zero out the transforms. So we'll start with the blade, right? So the goal here with the blade is, first we want to kind of figure out where we want to put a seam, because obviously if I try to unfold this, nothing's going to happen. So the reason this is purple is because the shells are overlapping right now. So I need to kind of place a cut essentially to unfold this flat. So much like, as grotesque as it might sound, kind of like skinning an animal, you want to kind of skin it, cut it, and lay it flat, or even maybe like origami, we have to put a cut in there to fold a piece of paper, or unfold it, I should say. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to go to edge mode, and I'm going to find an edge that just so happens to go around. So if I double click and I hit 4, I'm just going to kind of see what my selection was. So hopefully that's large enough for you to see. Now it doesn't look like my selection went all the way around. So you know what? Let's just grab another edge. Let's try this one. And that one did, okay? So I can see that went all the way around. I'm gonna bring my cursor over here into the UV editor, hold shift, right click, go to cut. Now these shells should be separate. So if I switch to my shell mode, I can grab this blade and just move it over, right? So one's red, that's the bottom one because it's flipped, and then the blue one is facing the correct way. So I'm not a big fan of seeing the shaded view over here in the 3D viewport. So if I hold shift and left click on this icon, I can turn it off in the viewport. Click apply and we're good. So I could do this. I can go to modify, I can do flip, kind of do that. That works too. So red basically means it's mirrored. This is technically a workable result. This is not wrong. If you were to apply text to this, it would be mirrored. So that would be a potential problem, right? But if you were to mirror the text, knowing that, it would still look fine. But typically we want to just simply face this the right way. So what I do is I typically unfold to do that. And the benefit is twofold, pun not intended. So when I unfold it, it does flip it the right way, but it also makes sure that it is a little bit better, less distorted. So this particular object, for instance, has the side of the blade attached, or yeah, the side of the blade. So if I unfold it, notice that that edge is becoming visible, right? Now, if I were to view the checker pattern, and let me just go ahead and increase this real quick. Let's go even further, because how do you know when to unfold, right? Like, essentially, if I need to unfold, I'm looking at the checker here. If the checker looks good, it's good. If it's stretching or distorted in any way, then I probably want to unfold that region. So if I look a little bit more closely on the edge here, I can see it's actually pulling. It's taking that pixel and stretching it. It's because it's like sitting vertically on top of itself. We need to lay this flat. So if I just take all of this to UV shell, shift right click, unfold, unfold, check out the difference. Now there's a little bit of distortion, but I would argue from this distance, which will probably be even closer than what we would normally be, it'll be just fine, right? Essentially, that blade, it's done. Let's go back to the handle. This is probably the most complex piece right here, but it's actually not too bad, I promise you. Let me adjust this guy so the checkers are a little bit more recognizable. So we can see we're definitely getting some stretching and distortion on the sides because we projected in Y. Looks like we're having some issues here on the inner side of the handle, and it's probably doing the same at the top. Yep. So let's go ahead and cut this. So the most reasonable place to cut this would be on the side, right? If you think about it, we want to kind of mask these seams. So if we were like UVing the human face, we're not going to run a UV seam right down the cheek. That would be silly. We'd run it in the hairline, the back of the head, or behind the ear, or something like that out of view. So I'm just going to double click an edge, and I'm just going to cut. This edge just so happens to go all the way around. So let's do that. Shift right click, cut. Now, one feature you might not have turned on. So notice how my cuts are actually highlighted. It's this icon right here. Just make sure that's turned on. This will help you preview your cuts. Now, if I were to try and move this, I can't separate it. I'm missing an area. My cut is not complete, but the cut went all the way through. Well, it turns out I'm missing this area, so I need to cut these areas out. So a good rule of thumb when you're about to cut a bevel is just grab that middle bevel and cut on that. We'll do the same at the bottom, and we'll cut here. Cut. Now if we move these apart, we get something like that. So this is that inner piece, this is the bottom, and this is the top. So let's just see what happens. Let's just unfold what we have here. So I'll just select everything and shift right click, unfold, unfold, and we get something like that. It's not perfect, but it's actually quite workable. Now, if we were to look at this, you can see it's actually looking pretty decent up here. Oh yeah, that's not looking so hot, right? That's really distorting pretty heavily. So what's happening? It's trying to unfold and go completely flat, this really kind of complex shape here in the corner. We're taking a three-dimensional corner, right? I don't remember if you guys remember like those paper crafts back in the day when you made like little boxes out of paper. And imagine trying to lay a corner of paper flat, right? It wouldn't work, it would tear. So we need to introduce some more cuts, right? So anytime we see distortion like this, we just need more cuts. So let's do that. Let's just work with the top. And if I need to find the top, we can just kind of highlight these. So that's the bottom. So this one we'll work on. Turn that off for now. So let's just move this over. And let's see where we can cut this that makes the most sense. So I think I would actually go ahead and extract these inner elements here, right? And probably do the same at the bottom. So let's just do that. So I'm going to double click on an edge and see if I get lucky. And I did, right? Whoever modeled this did a decent job and gave me an edge loop that goes all the way around the handle. So bring my cursor over here, shift right click, cut. Let's separate these elements. That's the top, and it probably did it over here as well. There's the top. So anytime I make changes, I want to revisit this and unfold, and let's just see what happens. So I'm going to go ahead, select all these components we're looking at, and unfold. All right, look at the difference. Watch this corner. See the difference? Significant. Much, much, much better. I might argue it's not perfect. Don't worry about this kind of bend. That's normal. It's a three-dimensional object, right? If it's bending in UV space, it's going to bend over here. Worry more about the consistency of the square. So, and the inside is getting cleaned up too, because we kind of extracted those elements and now they're unfolding flat. I mean, look at the shape difference there. So if we were to look at this like straight up and Y, you can kind of see that shape. This represents that shape much more authentically. Cool. So let's do the same with the other shape. Just give that a quick unfold. Much better. Now the bottom's still giving us trouble, so let's go ahead and do the same with the bottom. Double click, shift right click, cut. Cut went all the way through. Beautiful. Let's just select everything and unfold. And much, much better, right? And if I need to visualize my checkers a little bit better, I can increase the repetition of them. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Let's try it again. Love it. It was working just a second ago. You all witnessed it, and now it's not. Thank you, Autodesk. So if that doesn't work, we can just scale the shells up, and that will repeat the checker a bit more as well. So crisis averted. And we can kind of see that's working pretty good. It's a little distorted, but honestly, I would argue good enough. Good enough. Now the inside's still a problem. That's this guy right here. So trying to take this 3D cylinder and lay it flat. So let's just give it a quick cut. Now, if I were to just say double click here, this loop goes all the way through, right? And I could go in, zoom in, click here, click here, click here, and that would work, but that's kind of time consuming, especially if there's a lot more edge loops, right? We don't want to do that. Nobody's got time for that. Just double click it in UV space. The edge will terminate at the seam. Shift right click, cut, and then just give it a quick unfold. And if we want to view the checker, if it's fine, trust me, if I just rotate this straight up and down, you can see the checker is good. The handle is done. Right? We're not done UVing it, right? We got shells all over the place. Textile density is not set, but typically I save that for last. So we have a couple more shapes here. We could cylindrical map this, or I could just simply cut and unfold. And that's looking good. It's not perfect. Again, this is kind of a special case scenario. Let me scale this up so you can see this a little bit better. You can see it is distorting a little bit, but again, I think it's just not worth breaking it up into more shells. And as you do this more and more and more, you'll notice where you can kind of make those shortcuts. So don't panic. This one, same idea. I'm just going to introduce some cuts. I'm going to just cut the bottom off. So if I double click on this edge, it again just so happens to go around. And if it doesn't, try a different edge, right? Shift right click, cut, and let's unfold. We get something like that. That's going to work pretty nicely. Now this one is distorted because we're getting that similar where we're getting a corner. So usually where you have sharp corners, you're going to get seams or bad distortion. So what we can do is just cut that corner and give it a quick unfold. And I just want you to note the difference. So I'll cut here as well. Oops. And I'll unfold this area. Look at the difference. See what it did here and how it's kind of fixing that as well, as opposed to what we did over here. Both will work for this particular shape, so I'm not too worried about it, but that's how we can kind of clean that up as well. So I'll unisolate that, and let's left. We got the little bitty bolt, this guy. So this one's also kind of a special case, because if I hit 3, remember how I told you to kind of cut that bevel, that middle bevel? If I zero this out, real estate, thank you. Channel box, go away. Attribute editor, go away. So notice when I hit 3, watch where this middle bevel goes. Right? It's right here. If I were to introduce a cut, I still have a little bit of this area that's slightly visible. So instead, I'm going to cut it here. Right? And I'll do the same on the inside, or I'm sorry, the other side, not the inside. Just grab that one. And I know I'm going to have to unfold this cylinder, so I'll just go ahead and cut that as well. So I'm just hitting G to repeat last command. I've cut, and now I'll just go ahead and select all this, shift right click, unfold and unfold, and it's done. I know I'm not looking at the checker, but you know, shapes like this typically unfold with no issues. So that's the top and bottom. Here's the size. Now, all right, so textile density. Let's take a look at that. Let me zero this all out so they all kind of snap back together. All right, so all the pieces are here, right? And textile density is where we want to have the checkers a consistent size across the entire mesh. And right now, that is definitely not the case, right? All our shapes are all over the place. Why is this important? Having a consistent textile density ensures that our texture looks consistent across the entire mesh. So what could happen is this. Students will oftentimes do this. They'll take the blades. So we'll take both of these and they'll scale them down like this, all right? Now what's gonna happen is when you texture this, you're giving a lot more texture resolution to say the handle and all these other components than say the blade. So I want you to think about this not in so much checker, but now think of it as like pixels. How many pixels of information are we giving the blade in relation to this, right? We want them to be proportional based off their size. So in the past, this is what we did. We scaled up all the shapes until the checkers matched. Nobody's got time for that. There's better ways now. So let's go back to our UV toolkit. We're going to go to our transform rollout, scroll down. Here's our textile density tool. We're going to select one of your favorite shells. In this case, this one's my favorite. I'll click get. Notice the number has changed. And now I'm going to select everything and click set. All right, again, get, select your shell, select everything, click set. Everything is now set to that density. So all my checker is consistent across my entire mesh. Perfect, wonderful. So now I need to get everything in the 0 to 1 space, right? And in the past, again, what we would do is we kind of position all of this and try to get it there until we were happy. We have better methods. So we're gonna go to modify layout. We're gonna take a look at the options here. Again, make sure your 3D unfold is turned on. And I'll reset my tool real quick. The one feature I do turn on is rotate shell. I'm going to allow this tool to rotate my shells to better fit it into UV space. I'm also going to give it some shell padding and tile padding. So shell padding is how many pixels between the shells. So we don't want them to contact, right? We want to give them a couple pixels to breathe. This is good for painter. And tile padding is how many pixels of space we give it from the edge of the UV space. Everything else is good, uniform scale. We've already set our textile density. This will make sure nothing changes. We'll click apply. We'll let that process. This will actually perform an unfold function as well. And there we go. We actually got a pretty darn decent result. Now it's a bit chaotic, right? We have shells scattered everywhere, but for the most part, we're maximizing that 0 to 1 space. Look how much little or how little space we've wasted here, right? Fantastic, that's great. And if you were to turn this in as is, correctly, mind you, with the UVs transferred in the proper UV snapshot, you would get 100 for the scraper blade. Okay, now this isn't always going to work, the layout tool. For the pulley, it's not going to work, sorry. Because of the way the rings are set up, they tend to put them side by side and end up wasting a lot of space. So sometimes it does pay to kind of position these by hand. So if you wanted these to be a little bit cleaner, by all means do so. And you could potentially even get a little bit more space out of it by scaling everything up slightly. You could probably better position these, right? So the layout tool isn't always perfect. It's not going to give you the best results. So make sure you go back and refine it if you can, right? So just be aware of that. Sometimes what happens is it kind of underscales it. It'll still fit it. Now this is like an extreme example, right? Let's say it did something like this and we had a lot of extra space. Maybe it kind of, I've seen this where it kind of does all this and kind of puts this all down here, something like that. And we end up with a lot of space up here. Try to maximize that. You might have to go back and scale it up a little bit and kind of reposition. So don't be afraid to do that. But I got lucky. So UV snapshot. So please, 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 don't do this. Do not hit Command-Shift-4, marquee this, and submit this for your submission. This is not what I'm looking for. You'll lose points for this, okay? Do not confuse UV snapshots with screenshots. The proper UV snapshot is to select the object in object mode. So make sure you select everything that's relevant to this. So notice I marqueed from here to here. I missed some objects. So we have to make sure we add everything. Marquee the whole thing, right? I feel like there was something there. Am I crazy? No, I had moved those. That's why. Second guessing myself. And now if we go to, oh, perfect. The wall wants to come along for the ride. If we go to modify, not modify, image UV snapshot. Set it to 2K, 2048 by 2048 PNG, and we'll save this on the desktop as a proper UV snapshot. And click apply. And now when we look at this, it's going to look extremely different. It's going to probably look like this, but this is an actual UV snapshot, okay? Not this. Do not submit this. Please, please do not submit this. Cool. All right, so we've UV'd this scraper blade, but now we want to kind of get it back over to this particular object. So how do we do that? Actually, it's quite straightforward. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to select all of this, and I'm going to recombine it, right? Cool. Delete your history, probably a good idea. We've made a lot of changes here. And I'm going to hold this guy. I'm going to make sure it's selected. I'm going to hold Shift and click this guy. And I'm going to go over to Mesh and Transfer Attributes. We'll go to the options, and there's only one setting we need to change, sample space. We're going to go from world to component and click apply. Ooh, look at that. So this is going to happen if you're not careful. The UV transfer failed. Why? The vertex order has changed because the way we combine this is not how this one was combined initially. And because we don't know how this one was combined initially, I don't even know, we're just going to separate it and separate this one and transfer one by one. So if I do a mesh transfer, and we look at this, it should be better. Now this one's all busted, so we'll transfer that one as well. Hit G to repeat last command. And make sure you get those little guy components too. So I'll skip on that. And that should work. Now, let's say we're happy. We've transferred everything and it's looking good. All right, let's get rid of this guy. We're done with it. Delete. All of it. It's all gone. And we move on. Here's what's going to happen. The UVs are going to go back to the way they went. So actually, this shouldn't even be here. I'm surprised that even stuck around. It's going to go back to its initial look because there was a history link between the two. So we need to delete the history before we delete the objects. So just make sure you select your history or your objects here. Option Shift Delete will delete history. And now if I delete these guys, it's all good. They're all there, right? And again, I didn't do the smaller components. Don't worry about that. I didn't transfer those, so those are still busted. If you see them bold like this, if every line is bold, that means you need to retransfer. All right, so that's the pulley. The scraper I'm not going to complete, but I am going to show you a few techniques. So this one, let's turn the checker off here so we can actually see what we're doing. We're going to again start with the create planar, and we get something like that. And I will also separate this one. So this will make your life a lot easier. Let me go ahead and center my pivot. So we get this object, right? Check out how easy this one is. Just give it a quick unfold. We'll give it a quick cut, right? Because we don't want it to be circular like that, because if we look at our checker, it's gonna be all kinds of distorted. So if I cut it and then I unfold this, boom, there we go. So that piece is pretty much done. We still want to kind of break it up into multiple pieces, because what's going to happen, I guarantee you, somebody's going to scale this down, and now their texel density is completely out of whack. So you got to be careful about that. We do have this one special piece here, this inside component, all right? We don't ever see this because the cogs overlap this, so we're actually going to kind of eliminate it. So let me just turn this off. Let's go ahead and break this up real quick. So unfortunately, we can't like double click this edge. It's not going to go all the way around. You can blame Jared for that one. So please send an email saying to please fix the model. Shift right click, cut, and we'll just kind of make our way around this and continue to cut. Actually, he's on our Discord, so if you want to just message him directly and be like, what's up with this model? I would actually appreciate that. Just give him no other context. Just be like, what's up with this pulley model? Hopefully he's not in this GoTo training secretly watching. All right, so I've cut the top. I've gone completely around. Now I do want to cut the bottom, but I'm just going to cut it in a different area. I'm just going to cut it like right here. And now I can technically kind of move this top piece. Oh, it looks like I might have missed something. Nope, I just selected the wrong one. So there's the top. I'll give that a quick unfold. That's done, which is nice. So don't ever overcut this one. You can kind of keep this simplified. Here's the two things I want to show you. So this inner piece, if I hit 3, look at that bevel. All right, I'm going to hit 3. I'm going to grab this bevel, and I'm going to grab this bevel. I'm going to cut. And now I'm left with a couple shells. I'm going to go back to one mode. So this shell was the bottom side of the top. So what we can do is simply this. I'm going to unfold it. And instead of doing this, where this is what the layout tool will give you, just put the rings side by side, and you'll have a lot of rings. It's going to waste a lot of space. So we're going to break the texel density a little bit. We're going to go against the grain and just scale it up. Just enough to go around it. This is going to be more efficient, despite kind of breaking the texel density. It's too little of, it's just not worth fighting, right? This is just going to be a better result overall. And then this piece in the middle, I'll unfold it and I'll give it a quick cut. I don't even need to cut it, but I'll show you why here in a second. This is that center piece we never see. Make sure when you hit 3 that your cut ends here, not somewhere up here, right? You don't want to have this edge cut up here because then that will be visible. Here's why. We're actually going to take this piece and scale it all the way down and just throw it in the middle. We never see it. Let's make room for everything else that's far more important, okay? And you'll see that in our example. So if you look right here, there's that piece, right? We scaled it down. Jared, in this example, he used the cylindrical mapping, so it gives a bit of a straighter result, but honestly, if you were to unfold it, you'll get the result I have, and which is actually technically a better result. You can still make it work though, so use your best judgment. You can see we are stacking the rings here to maximize that UV space. So there's very little wasted space. We had to break up the cogs and even the inner part of the cog or the pulley into multiple pieces, right? We can't have those really long stretches to make that work. Whew. And then again, transfer the UVs, you're good to go. Submit the files required, which is just a UV snapshot, your scene file, and a render. And you are golden. All right, questions? Because that's pretty much all I have for you. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and end the recording. And this recording will be available sometime tomorrow. I'll just post it both on Discord and on FSO. As if you end up having questions either way, just feel free to contact me. I'll keep the GoTo training open for a little bit, so if you have a question that's more specific, it won't be recorded, okay?